They said the Vikings only cared about gold and glory. They were wrong. For some enemies, the Norse saved something far colder than a simple axe to the neck. The blood eagle, where ribs were hacked away from the spine and lungs were dragged out like wet, twitching wings. The hung meat, where a man's belly was open and his intestines tied to a post, forcing him to walk in circles as his own body unwound around him. The fatal walk, that same nightmare turned into a slow-motion execution, each step a countdown toward collapse. The ritual hanging in the grove, bodies swaying among the sacred trees as offerings to gods who demanded blood instead of prayers. And the slave sacrifice at the ship burial, where living people were strangled and stabbed so a dead chieftain would not sail into the next world alone. These were not quick deaths. These were messages carved into flesh, punishments meant to echo in the minds of anyone who even dreamed of crossing them. Stay with this story to the end, because the last torture on this list is the one even historians hesitate to describe out loud. This is not the Viking story of longboats on shining water and warriors drinking in smoky halls. This is the side of the North that sagas whisper about, and priests wrote down with shaking hands. The punishments reserved for traitors, enemy kings, helpless slaves, and those unlucky enough to be turned into examples. In this episode of Execution Stories, the journey goes deep into 5 of the most brutal Viking tortures ever recorded or remembered in Norse tradition. Acts that mixed execution, humiliation, and ritual into something far worse than a simple killing. These methods were designed not only to end a life, but to shatter honor, terrify witnesses, and prove that Viking vengeance could reach beyond the grave itself. Tonight, these 5 nightmares will be counted down, from cruel to almost unthinkable. Let's start with number 5 torture method. And don't miss number 1, because number 1 is considered the most brutal in all of Viking history. Number 5, slave sacrifice at the ship burial. They called them thralls, slaves taken in raids, bought in markets, born into chains. To the Vikings, thralls were property, tools, and sometimes offerings. In parts of Scandinavia during the Viking Age, powerful chieftains and warriors were buried with their weapons, their ships, and in some cases, living people who were forced to die so they could serve in the next world. Archaeology and written accounts suggest that when an important man died, his ship or burial chamber could be prepared like a frozen scene of his life. Weapons, animals, and human victims arranged around his body before the grave was closed. Some slaves were strangled with ropes. Others showed signs of stabbing and blunt trauma. And in a few graves, broken bones and cut marks hint at deliberate killing rather than accident or later disturbance. Their only crime was being owned by the wrong man at the wrong time. The torture in this method was not only physical, but terrifyingly psychological. Imagine being chosen, bound, dragged toward the ship where your dead master already lay. You would hear chanting, feel hands on your throat, or a blade at your ribs, knowing you were being murdered not for what you had done, but to decorate someone else's afterlife. Some were likely given alcohol or drugs, but the fear of watching others die before you, of hearing their last breaths in a cramped burial space, would have been its own slow torture. These killings symbolized absolute ownership. A thrall's life could be switched off like a torch the moment his master's eyes closed. In the eyes of those watching, it sent a clear message. Here, human life was just one more object to bury with the dead. But this ritual slaughter of the powerless was only the beginning. The next method did not wait for the chieftain to die. It created its own hanging grove of horror while the crowd watched. But this was nothing compared to what comes next. Number 4. Ritual hanging in the sacred grove. Viking belief was soaked in sacrifice. To them, Odin himself had hung 9 nights on the world tree, pierced by a spear, trading his own body for wisdom and power. Some followers imitated that story in the darkest way possible, by hanging others in sacred groves, turning execution into an offering to the gods. In certain Norse and broader Germanic traditions, rituals involved bodies left swinging from trees, sometimes alongside animals, their corpses meant to please divine forces or secure victory and good harvests. While detailed Viking Age descriptions are rare, hints survive of sacred sites where the dead were strung up as public sacrifices. For the condemned, this was not a clean soldier's death. It was a slow strangling, surrounded by holy symbols that offered no mercy. The mechanics were simple, but cruel. A rope around the neck, hands possibly bound. The condemned hoisted from the ground or pushed from a height with the noose tied above. As their weight dropped, the rope tightened, crushing the windpipe, cutting off air. Their feet kicked helplessly, toes scraping at nothing, eyes bulging as the blood rushed to the face. If the fall was short and the neck did not break, strangulation could drag on for minutes that felt like years. The smell of earth, the creak of branches, the muffled prayers or jeers of onlookers, all would sink in as consciousness slowly faded. Emotionally, this was more than a killing. It was a statement that even the gods were watching and agreeing. To hang someone in a sacred grove meant their suffering had a cosmic audience, that their death was being turned into a ritual symbol of power and control. To the living, walking past a grove strung with the dead was a silent warning. Your body could become part of the landscape, your final breath swallowed by tree roots and cold air. And the next method was even more terrifying. Number 3. The fatal walk. Not every Viking punishment was over quickly. Some sagas describe torment that took the form of a journey, a fatal walk where the victim was forced to move until his own body destroyed itself. In one such legendary scene, a man's abdomen is sliced open, his intestines pulled out and tied around a tree or post, and then he is driven forward. Step by step, he walks, and step by step, his guts unwind from his body. While the sagas mix history with storytelling, the idea of disembowelment as vengeance fits a feud culture where humiliation and visible suffering mattered as much as death itself. The logic was cruel but clear. If you betrayed someone, killed their kin, or broke an oath, your punishment would mirror the pain you caused. Drawn out, public, unforgettable. The procedure, as described, is horrifying. First, the victim is restrained. Then a blade opens the belly, cutting through skin and muscle, releasing heat and blood. The torturer reaches inside and finds the intestines, wet and heavy, dragging them out and tying the first length around a fixed object. Then the victim is forced, beaten, pushed, or prodded, to walk away. With every step, more of his insides are dragged from his body. Pain would be beyond words, a burning, tearing agony with every movement, the body trying desperately to stay alive as its own core unspools into the dirt. This torture symbolized complete unraveling. It didn't just kill the victim, it pulled him apart in front of everyone, turning his body into a horrible path on the ground. For witnesses, the message was blisteringly clear. In a world where honor and revenge ruled, there were fates worse than a clean blade. The fatal walk turned death into a procession of agony, a punishment that literally went on until there was nothing left inside to give. But the Vikings had an even colder name for the next horror. They called it hung meat. Number 2. Hung meat. Some saga traditions describe enemies being strung up by their heels, bodies inverted and exposed, turned into something less than human, hanging, bleeding, and helpless like slaughtered animals. This punishment is sometimes referred to in modern discussion as hung meat, a brutal inversion of a person's dignity and position. In at least one tale examined by historians, men are hoisted up by their feet and suspended, leaving their heads down, blood rushing to their skulls, disorientation and pain setting in almost immediately. In such a position, breathing becomes difficult, the heart strains, and the victim's own body starts working against him. If beaten, cut, or left for long periods, the suffering multiplies. Intense pressure in the head, swelling, dizziness, and a growing sense that the world has flipped and will never right itself again. To amplify the torment, torturers could beat the hanging prisoners, slice at exposed flesh, or leave them to sway in the wind, turning their bodies into living warnings. In a culture that slaughtered animals for winter food, the sight of a man hanging upside down like butchered meat was deliberate and symbolic. He was no longer a warrior, a neighbor, or a rival. He was a carcass displayed for mockery and fear. Emotionally, this method was about stripping away every layer of identity. By hanging someone like meat, the executioner said, "You are not a man, not even a proper enemy. You're just a body to be handled, stored, and slowly ruined." For anyone watching, the humiliation was as sharp as the pain. If it could happen to him, it could happen to anyone who stood on the wrong side of Viking vengeance. But even this grotesque display of human meat was still not the most infamous Viking torture. Number 1 is a ritual so extreme that for centuries people argued whether it could possibly be real. Number 1. The blood eagle. At the top of this list stands the nightmare that has haunted books, TV shows, and historical debates alike: the blood eagle. This was not an everyday punishment. In the sagas, it appears as a special vengeance reserved for the most hated enemies. Kings and leaders who had killed a kinsman, shamed a family, or committed a bad death that demanded an even worse answer. According to several Norse sources and later retellings, the ritual began with the victim captured alive, often after battle. He was laid face down or kneeling, his back exposed. Then came the blade. The executioner cut deeply into the flesh along the spine, peeling away skin and muscle to reach the ribs. One by one, those ribs were severed from the spine with knives, axes, or even specially shaped spears, then wrenched outward to form a crude, jagged pair of wings spreading from the victim's back. In the most extreme versions, the lungs were then pulled out through the gaps and draped over the ribs, fluttering as the last air escaped. Modern anatomical research has argued that, horror aside, such a procedure was physically possible with Viking tools, but that the victim would likely lose consciousness quickly from pain, blood loss, and suffocation, dying early in the process while the rest of the ritual was performed on a corpse. That does not make it less terrifying. If even part of it was done while the victim was alive, the agony would be indescribable. Burning cuts along the spine, the cracking of bone, the sensation of one's own body being opened like a door. Symbolically, the blood eagle was vengeance turned into art. In some translations, it was said that no sound of screaming should escape the victim's mouth if he wished to die with honor, adding a layer of psychological torture. Suffer in silence as your body is turned inside out. The eagle carved on the back may have represented Odin's birds of battle, or simply a grotesque emblem of victory. Your enemy transformed into a broken, bleeding symbol of your power. Whether every saga account is literal or not, the image itself has been enough to scar the imagination of generations. This was more than execution. It was a performance of cruelty, a spectacle designed to echo through song and story, so no one would forget what happened to those who murdered a great Viking or betrayed his kin. And if the blood eagle really was carried out, even once it tells us something terrifying. Human imagination is sometimes the sharpest weapon of all, from slaves strangled and stabbed to decorate a dead man's ship, to bodies hanging in sacred groves as food for gods and crows, from men forced on fatal walks as their own intestines traced their last steps, to human beings inverted as hung meat, and finally to the blood eagle, where the back was carved open and lungs were dragged out like tattered wings. These 5 Viking tortures show how far people have gone to turn punishment into a message carved into flesh. This is the dark side of human history. A world where justice, revenge, and ritual blurred until suffering itself became a kind of language, spoken in screams and silence. These aren't just old legends. They are warnings about what happens when honor and hatred are given complete power over the human body. If you want more real execution stories and forbidden history from the shadows of our past, don't let this be the last tale you hear tonight. Like this video if the truth shocked you, subscribe to Execution Stories, and tell in the comments which torture disturbed you the most, and which dark corner of history should be exposed next. This is the part of the past the world tries to forget. But here, the stories keep breathing.